Yeah, so thanks for joining, guys. Wasn't sure there was going to be this many people because it was kind of short notice, I think, for most people. So I had a week to plan for this, so I'm sorry if there isn't a shitload of examples, but I think it will actually be quite good. So my name is Rudy Stradom. I work at Xander, senior front-end dev there. And I mean, PHP, we've all, I'm sure, used it to quite a large extent, and it might not be the shiny new tech on the platform. It might not be fast, although these days it is a bit faster, or pretty, you know. But we have to work on it. It does fill a lot of holes, as far as it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to get started, right? So that's why we love it. But a lot of the time, we don't actually even check the performance of PHP. So I'm going to show you guys Xhprof. I had a particular incident that I deployed some code and I brought down the site a little bit. Just a little bit, it wasn't too much. But it basically came down to I was refactoring a large portion of the code base, and the refactor wasn't very performant. And it was only evident once we actually deployed it. So one of the internal tools we use is Xhprof. Works pretty well. It's not super complicated or anything. It was written by the Facebook devs. And it works. I mean, there are other tools out there. I think Blackfire is one, something like that. Yes. You can also use Xdebug's built-in profiler to export files. There's a couple of options available to you. I like Xprofiler, and I'll show you guys why. So I think let's just dive in here. I put this together. It's a small sample site running on Docker. I'll give everybody that's interested the links, and you can actually spin it up on your own machine and have a look and play with it and basically see this entire little site. So for me, one of the big things is that measuring, right? So a lot of times, a lot of companies I've worked for, we don't actively measure the site's performance, and it's very important because it's for you in development to spot performance issues before it goes to live. So you'll see there at the bottom, this is a sample output that took, I don't know how much that is, it's very low, seconds to render this page, that amount of memory. Super minimalistic, and 0 SQL queries. So let's start off with this one. So I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir, and a lot of this hopefully you all know, and I'm just reiterating it. So I mean, measuring performance or application time is basically when it hits your PHP stack or Java or whatever, how long your application takes to give a response back to the client. So it's not network latency and all that. It's basically how long it stays in your application before it ships back to the client. A great tool for measuring that is New Relic, of course. I think majority of people use it, even though they can be quite expensive. But they are excellent. They really are excellent at seeing that change over time. So like I mentioned, in this example, I'm rendering out that little snippet. And that for me is the 3 key elements to measure performance. I'm pretty sure if you could, with an application, measure the I/O, that would probably be the next best thing to measure. I'm not sure how to go about doing that on PHP though. But so Xhprof itself is very simple to install. It's a little Peckle library. You install it, and then you get this. This is probably the easiest way to add it to your stack. So without having to go and change your stack, it's just to auto-prepend a file, a particular file, which then fires it up on receiving a get param or session variable or whatever it might be. That's just an example of that. And then this is what I used to create that little snippet. So straightforward, 37 lines, as little as I could, basically, just to print that out. And I mean, most frameworks will offer you a performance measuring system. I don't think we all use them at any time. The other problem is that our applications are custom for the most part. I don't know anyone who uses a framework within the bounds of the framework 100% of the time. It doesn't happen. We add on this little piece here, and it's not quite standard, but we allow it because it works, and it just carries on building like an onion over time. In this case, all I have is this little, it's a button, but it literally just sets a get variable, and in that auto prepend file knows that Xhprof has to start. It starts, and it starts to measure the page. So if we just have a look at that, just as an example, so it's now profiled the page, and then open this up in a new tab. If it switches, no, screw you. Dang it. So then that's what Xhprof looks like. It basically has a list of all your previous runs, and it actually has the host in there, so you could very easily run Xhprof on your local with laptop hardware, your staging with manageable hardware, and production with beast hardware, and see the difference. And what's nice is you can also take a benchmark before you deploy code versus after you deploy code to make sure it lives up to what you expect. So there's a lot of information on here. The more important things is basically how many microseconds it took to render the page, and then highlighting the individual methods that were run, that was run to generate the page. Usually I just go excluding wall time to give me a proper indication. I mean, these are microseconds, so it's really, it's very little. I mean, you can see the PHP main loop there, so it is really very little that this framework that I use is actually doing to render this little page. So super simple, and then you can drill down into these individual methods. It shows you firstly what the current function was doing. You see the parent function there, and what child function, so any other methods that it ran in that function. It also highlights them. It shows you how many times it was called to actually render the page out, for example, and then what was the most time consuming. So very, very good for debugging our beloved PHP. So let me just switch back quickly. So let's have a look. So one of the things that is broken in this current screen, hope you guys can see that. So guard clauses is a good way to ensure that PHP follows the shortest path of execution possible. So I like to think of it as the least likely circumstances to the most likely circumstances. Oh, yeah, I'm not sure. Let's have a look. So basically, instead of running through all this code to eventually return a false, if that is the normal flow of action, you'll hit it in the first line, return a false, and you always get that response back first. So if we look at the example here at the bottom, it's very similar. There isn't much different to it except that we're checking the empty before we return, and we're ensuring that way that the input provided is valid as well. You use that also a lot to check that the types is what you expect it to be, so it doesn't break lower down. It really is very useful optimization. It might be seen as a micro optimization, but if you apply it consistently, it becomes a macro optimization. So let's have a look at what this does. when we open it in Xhprof. So I'm just going to again swap it so it is from or it's excluding wall time, so it's the actual time it took to process this individual method. So if we look here, I called that previous method the pyramid method, and it is slightly more efficient. I mean, this is 20% performance increase if you do a one-to-one method comparison. And like I mentioned, I mean, it might seem insignificant, but over a period of time it becomes more significant, especially the amount of calls that specific method does. Another great thing about Xhprof is this image that they provide you. So it's basically a call stack in an image form, and they highlight the most expensive parts, which is pretty rad. Let me just zoom out here a bit. So there you guys can see. Sorry, I actually missed a part. There's the two for eaches. There's a very slight difference between the two. In this case, I missed a particular part. Sorry, I'm going to check it. Probably including it, but not displaying it. So look. Sorry, there it was. I actually skipped a bit. So there's a couple of examples on this page. The other one I had here was the pyramid example, which was the most expensive one. What I was basically doing was getting a JSON document and decoding it. And here you can see I'm pretty sure most of us that do PHP at some point in your career wrote code like that. I know I have, unfortunately. And sometimes it's just a matter of readability, right? Versus this. And so we basically load a JSON file, check that it exists, if not, return. So why do we need to do all this extra work if the file doesn't exist in the first place? Then we try and get the contents. So if the contents is empty, why the hell do we need to do extra work? Return that. And then finally the same with JSON decode. These are expensive operations against the file system, and doing it in this fashion allows us to make sure that what we expect to be there is there, we can use it, do the extra processing against it. And they both yield exactly the same thing. So it works on my local. Yeah? It works on my local. So it is the way it goes. Code is pretty polymorphic. I mean, you can kind of change it out a bit. This one is I think the introduction to object-oriented programming uses car examples, and there's usually like a Honda Civic in there. So I made a little class. It's not super complicated. It's just a class to get and set cars. So here we go, an example of guarded versus non-guarded. You'll see that here we check that the car is luxury, and we do all these extra things, versus if it's not luxury, get the hell out of there, right? So it never does this little bit, and we also do the same if the car isn't modern. So that way, on the left hand side, you'll find that even though these two methods output exactly the same content, the one will do a lot more processing because it is iterating through these loops and iterating through these loops, doing all that extra bit versus getting out of there. So in this case, I mean, it's not a lot of time. It's 2 milliseconds to do this page, 4 megs of RAM. It's not a big performance indication, but it becomes more evident in large-scale applications. So let's head over to the next one. So the next one was the n+1 problem. I definitely hope everybody either knows this and knows how to guard against it, or they've been slapped a lot because of this. I originally learnt about it in the PHP Conf 2013, and I had stepped in this particular dog poop a couple of times myself. A lot of times unknowingly, because you're getting your data, it's rendering out, but because you're not physically seeing, or it's not obvious that there's how many, let's see, 9002 SQL queries run, it's not obvious to you that you've got an n+1 problem. Performance sure gets a knock, 1.2 seconds to render this page, where it could easily be run with a single join query. So this particular data set, I'm joining country code data onto subscriber database, and there's 9,000 entries in there. So for the 9,000 entries, I'm basically doing a bit of work there. It is guarded, so I do ensure that the code is there. But for every single iteration of the parent or parent relational database, I'm going and doing a subsequent query, and that is n+1 problem. I'm pretty sure everybody is familiar with it.
We often see this inside frameworks in ORMs as well.
It is,
so
yes.
Using an ORM, you don't always see it.
Yes.
And you haven't coded it necessarily.
Yes.
And in the back end, it's just moving.
The other big problem is a lot of the frameworks, if you do select star, it goes and describes table, then it does this as well, it will do it for each child table that you're trying to get out. So it is quite bad, and I'm pretty sure you can optimize it, rewrite that particular piece of abstraction to get a more performant application out of it. On the right hand side, there's basically, it is a join. The join is inherently slower in this particular case. There is no indexes on the tables, it's an example. So it is inherently slow, but if we were to go and look at this in Xhprof, did it right now? So here's our latest run. Screen so you can see. So 1.3 seconds to process that page. Obviously not ideal if it's a website and you still have to load CSS and all the other stuff. So definitely not great. But if we look at this, so database query has been called 9,002 times. It's not terribly efficient at all. So if we compare, so that's the +1. So let me just find the other one. So the other one is there. So 326 milliseconds versus a second and 62 microseconds, milliseconds, whatever it might be. So there's definitely no comparison between expensive network trips to a SQL database, and for every single page render, 9,002 queries. I'm no expert, but I don't know if MySQL was ever built to do that for a single page hit.
So Xhprof doesn't include all the networking, all of that doesn't measure that at all?
No, so it's literally the time it took for the application, but it's very evident to, or you can drill down and see individual processes, and
the network time will become more time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a code profile inside each network function. Okay.
So I mean the query itself, where is it? So okay, my code's not also terribly efficient because the quote alone takes 47 milliseconds to run. So there's definitely some optimization even there. It's a very small framework I use now. It's my baby, so I love it. And the call graph again, pretty evident what's wrong. Yeah, very evident what's wrong. It does also highlight, so there's the difference between the two. You zoom in now. So great difference between the two indeed. And it shows you the amount of calls that it had to do, one call versus 9,000 calls. Definitely not a micro optimization. Sorry, get back to the other. Whoa. Stop freaking out. Jeez, sorry, I hope nobody's epileptic, because that would not end well. Come on. And then the last, let's have a look. The last example I have here is kind of a combination of the above mentioned and then a couple of insights as well. Let's just get this running. So where things gets is important, super important. File operations are expensive, network time is expensive, and getting data is expensive, whether it is New Relic, Redis, there you go, hopefully that works, or even if you ever used SQLite for whatever reason. So if there was no option to use a proper database, it was running somewhere on a server to do some arbitrary thing, and you had to use SQLite, you know what pain. So one quote that's quite good in my opinion is, simplicity is the ultimate complexity, and especially in PHP it's very difficult. So we tend to do this object oriented architecture, but just firing that framework up in itself is very expensive at times. So keeping things simple is very, very difficult at times. In this example, let's have a look. So again, I'm using the JSON from before, and I've got a method that basically just prints the name, so a key out of the JSON data called name. So both are doing exactly the same thing. The only difference being that one does it directly against, so it's doing a file read every single time, versus doing it once and then using it. So it's kind of dependency injecting it, or injecting it and then getting the value out. And that is orders of magnitude as well, much faster. And sometimes it's not obvious because these files are separate, they're separate classes, and the one you see right in front of you, you're working on this one, you're calling this other class, and it's not obvious that it's actually quite expensive task to do. So then look at another example. So I'm pretty sure most of us have at some point written something similar to this. It's basically a logger class of sorts. You give it a file to write to, and you have a little method that you can write a single line of code to. And it's quite funny, on the left hand side we're opening it every single line right, versus on the right hand side in the constructor we're opening that file once, and then every write we're writing to that file, and on deconstruct we close the file handle. And I'll show you guys the performance of this one. It's quite remarkable. Literally where you're opening the file handle and where you're closing it. And then let's have a look at this last one. So this was one that I spotted on php.net. It's also not one that is super obvious if you've been coding for a week on a particular feature and you just don't know what is wrong, but it's slow. And it's basically in the for loop not to have that extra condition to count the range beforehand. It's an array, it's quite large, and every single for loop it's evaluating that count, and it's not super obvious. At least it wasn't to me. So it is something that you can easily miss. And let's have a look at what the performance looks like of these various things. So we'll do the first one. This one was where it was getting the JSON file finding the index and printing out the output. So we have, so if you look at the get euro, so to speak, where it actually just gets the contents of the file, it was called 49 times, and for what it did, it was quite expensive to actually use. So if we look at print names, so print names versus, where's the other one? Wait. Damn. Let's see. Here we go. So print names from an array, 36 milliseconds. It's not too bad. Versus 326 milliseconds. So it's literally just where we do things and how it's included. So I actually missed one, but we'll go back to that after this. Then that IO loop one. So IO, so that's the construct one. So this is where it was in the constructor. So construct test. So it wasn't much difference between having the constructor, so opening that file handle once, versus opening the file handle, closing it, opening it, but it's still a quarter of the performance of actually just having the file handle open, writing to it once we're done closing the file off. And even worse if you were to use get file contents, put file contents, because it does a bunch of this in a nice wrapper. So even worse. Let's have a look. Well, it's freaking out again. Calm down. So that was print names. Then we had a look at IO construct versus IO loop. And then this one. So looping in versus looping before. So looping. So that was the for, that the logic was inside the for declaration versus before the for declaration. And again, I mean, this is a good couple of percent. It's about 40% odd faster. By one little thing that you might, it's seemingly innocuous, you might not notice it. And only by doing this type of, if you see it is slow, bogging down, trying another variation of the same method, seeing how you can improve the performance of it, makes a huge difference at the end of the day. Then what we have down here is another example of loops. In this case, it is quite long though, unfortunately. I wasn't quite expecting the code to be this long. So what it boils down to is that if you look at the top here, I've got two select statements either side. The left hand side is basically fetching all the series in my series database, and then it's got a subsequent query declaration where I have a placeholder, and in the loop I'm getting all the shows, checking if it has a poster. If it doesn't have a poster, I'll skip the iteration, but basically on the left hand side I'm getting the show detail or the episode details to get all this craftiness at the bottom here. So both sides equal output, how many ratings it has, how many seasons, or what current season it's on, and how many episodes it has in total. And on the right hand side, the only difference being here is that I do two selects beforehand. So there's times where your joins aren't efficient for particular sets of data. So if you want to mix a straight up selection with count data and stuff like that, and max and so on, and it gets a bit confused at times, I've found, and a nice solution for that is doing these 2 or 3, or building up a larger query where you use in to then find the ID in a particular set. And this is, I mean, seemingly very similar code, does exactly the same thing at the end of the day, but performance wise quite a big difference. Let's have a look at that. So that was for each and for each. So it was sub-select versus pre-process. We're looking at 20 milliseconds versus 5. Is that? Yeah. So it's not a big improvement again, but it's things that add up. And if it's an entire site and an entire project, it could mean the difference between a 5-second render time and a 200 millisecond render time. For me, the big takeaway is you have to measure it to be able to manage it. PHP is not the most efficient language, we know that. It's basically an abstraction on top of C, whatever it might be. So obviously there's overhead. It might not be as efficient as Java and whatnot, but it doesn't mean that you can't optimize it. So writing good code is very important. Measuring it, super important. Knowing where to cache things and how to look out for things is very important. So I hope you guys enjoyed this or found this interesting. Unfortunately, I wish I had more time to actually break this down a bit more and give it in smaller bite-sized chunks for you guys. So that's about me. Sure.
Do you run Xhprof in production as well? So do you kind of leave it enabled and you can just at a drop of a hat click the flag and do a profile of it? Do you kind of do that in a separate environment with the same variables that were noticed in the production environment?
We do it on staging, so the staging is very similar hardware to live, and knowing that it's the same data set, probably, yeah. It is on one box. So I mean, you get the.
Which one? Okay.
So you can definitely test it. I mean, the feature I released was, I think, 3 times slower than the current code that was on there. So it was quite a hit to the servers. It actually brought the site down a little bit. So a portion of the site down. So it's something that in dev I never noticed. Honestly, I never noticed. We don't actively log these things out, and that's why I said most companies don't, because it takes time to go and write this tooling to make sure that in dev you have output of how fast or slow your application is. And I mean, not everybody is of similar skill level. Something that looks good to me, renders out perfectly, is super slow, versus someone who's more skilled, writes something and knows how to play with the code to make sure that it is efficient.
I think that's an important point. It's one of the great things about Xhprof is you can, the other tools as well, Xhprof and renders it and other things, but you can have rules in your production environments, and they could be linked to when you deploy code. So if you deploy code today, it will take a random snapshot of your actual production users. Let's say 10 times on the day of your deploy, 5 times on the next day, and then 1 day a week after that. So then your team, Xhprof, like a note in the database of results, and your team can come in on a Friday and just look at the results, pick a couple, look at the full graph, see if the deployment caused any like huge bubble somewhere. You really need to worry about it. And that's actually project. So the key is to get the actual user's data, because then you get the production use rather than the developers doing everything right.
Yeah, and the other thing is, a lot of the times when you're in dev, you're not clicking on stale links. Clients have these stale links in their browsers that I've got this link for Xander, let's just click there and go to the catalog. Meantime, that freaking URL is so broken, and it hits production and it completely balks, whatever it might be. And we don't cater for that in dev, if you basically hit that and it breaks the system, oh shit, you know. So it is quite important to make sure that you measure it against what's currently there as well. I think.
How does this thing relate to Xhprof profile?
I tried getting Xdebug's one running and I couldn't. I tried even on native. I couldn't get it running. It wouldn't kick in.
Well, that's my thing was that Xhprof slows down.
You can actually run it online, but I was saying that it's random snapshots rather than all variables.
No, that's the main difference. You don't want to run Xdebug. The Xdebug gives you, I think it's cache line or volume line after the cache line, and then you can do that and get back to the call log. You definitely don't want to run them in production. Whereas Xhprof, I actually think with the library, it's actually like a random thing. And it's literally like the empty-ran PHP function, and it profiles every one, well, it's actually just an empty-ran a number 1 to 100 or like profile.
You don't have to implement it that way.
Yeah,
You can implement it like any way you want.
Any way you want, yeah. So obviously, I definitely wouldn't run Xdebug.
Yeah, no, well, the thing is, I use the Xhprof profile as you guys are probably all familiar with the PHP Storm stuff. So PHP Storm has support for reading the files that something like Xhprof profile is in.
Okay.
So for instance, if there's one particular thing that I'm trying to find in the thing, you know, you get those sort of bugs that happen once in a while. People go like, oh, I can't figure out